Welcome to Smart Training 365 and welcome to another video with Doug Brignole. So Doug, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about why it's important to understand the basic physics of resistance exercise. And we're going to do this sort of in preparation to answer some of the original allegations that Kassem made in his first video and also some in his second. But in order to do that, I think it's important to establish some facts about what it is that we're talking about in terms of physics of resistance exercise.
Yeah, I hope people will find this clarifying and interesting, because I saw that many people commented even while the video, our response video was playing, and they weren't even paying attention to the points. They were making random comments as if what you're explaining is not related to his answer, and you answered those things. So people need also to pay attention of what you're explaining, because what's the point of watching the video and commenting without even understanding what you're saying?
Right. The title, of course, why understanding the basics physics of resistance exercise is important. And then there's an asterisk there, classical mechanics. So what's important to understand there is that physics has a lot of different categories. But classical mechanics is the category that deals with levers and pendulums and forces and things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about physics. We're talking about classical mechanics. And of course, this is also known as Kassem rebuttal number 2. So the reason why support beams in buildings and bridges are vertical is because of physics, right? You don't need any math to know that. You know that vertical is parallel with gravity and vertical is neutral. That's why support beams are vertical. So if I took a dumbbell and I put my elbow on a tabletop, I could hold a 50, 60, 70, 80 pound dumbbell in my hand without using any bicep force, as long as that forearm is vertical. It's basically a support beam. Now, let's just say I had an 80 pound dumbbell in my hand right here, and I could balance it just fine right there. Try holding an 80 pound dumbbell with your forearm horizontal. You couldn't do it, right? So you have to understand, first and foremost, that vertical, if we're talking about gravity, parallel with the direction of resistance, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a cable or whatever, is always neutral to whatever muscle is holding that limb. It's always neutral as long as it's parallel with the direction of resistance. The reason why a perpendicular force, when we apply it against a wrench, works better than pushing on that wrench in another direction, like from an angle or something, is again because of physics. A perpendicular force is maximally efficient. You don't need any math there. You don't need any trigonometry. You don't need to do any equations. All you have to know is, if you want to apply the most amount of force to a limb, to a lever, to whatever, you apply it perpendicularly. So what I have here is just basically a pendulum, right? So when it's hanging vertically, it's neutral. I don't have to do a thing to it to keep it in that position. Any muscle that's connected to that limb, let's say, will be without load because this limb is parallel with the direction of resistance. If I were to move this thing all the way up, it basically balances itself. Now, obviously, if you tip it just one way or the other, it'll sort of fall over, but you can see it doesn't require much force to keep it perfectly balanced. Now, if I go like this is horizontal. This is perpendicular to gravity. This is when that limb, that lever, is going to have the greatest downward force. Any muscle that is connected to a limb that is perpendicular to the direction of resistance will have to work the hardest at that particular point, right? So this is 0. This is maximum. Oops. This is 0 again, right? So now it stands to reason that the points in between minimum and maximum are percentages thereof, right? So if you have a limb that's at a 45-degree angle like this, it's going to have less than 0, but less than 100%, but more than 0, right? So it's not important to know the exact amount of actual weight that muscle is holding, but it is important to know that it is a percentage, all right? So Let's just go on from there, and I'll come back to that percentage in just a moment. So here's the rule. Any limb that is parallel with the direction of resistance is neutral. In my book, we talk about neutral levers and active levers. Any lever that is, any muscle that is holding a neutral limb lever is not loaded at all. Conversely, any limb that is perpendicular with the direction of resistance is maximally loading the muscle that's holding it. 100% of the available resistance. And what is the available resistance? It's whatever weight you're holding in your hand, multiply times the length of the limb that's holding it, right? And usually it's a ratio, 12-1, for example. Like if it's the bicep, there's about a 1-inch distance between the joint and the muscle attachment, and about a 12-inch difference between the muscle attachment and the hand. So that's a 12-1 ratio, right? So you can do it in centimeters, you can do it on anything, but it's a ratio. So you multiply times the length of the limb, right? There's another factor too, which is the direction from which the muscle is pulling on the limb, whether it's parallel or perpendicular to it. But what we're trying to do is establish the effect of the direction of resistance on that limb. Okay, so that last paragraph is any limb that is between vertical and perpendicular with resistance loads its operating muscle with a percentage of the available load. Okay, so is it worth knowing the approximate percentage of the weight being lifted that is loading the muscle? Yes, it's worth knowing the approximate percentage, right? So if a limb is at a 45-degree angle, you could say it's approximately half the load it could have if that limb was perpendicular to resistance. Approximately half, right? Do we need to know the exact percentage, the exact amount of weight that the muscle? No, we don't need to know the exact amount of weight, because what we want to do is we want to teach people who are out in this world lifting weights in gyms. We want to get them to understand what qualifies as an efficient exercise. The more perpendicular the resistance is to the limb that's working the target muscle, the more efficient it is. So most of what we're talking about here is just basically an exercise to compare, to show you the difference between a limb that is mostly neutral versus a limb that is mostly fully active, and how much that affect, how much load that is to the operating muscle.
Doug, let's just say that differently now. For those who said that your math is wrong, that means when you say it's not important here, that means that you don't know the math and you're trying to just say it's physics. It's better to calculate it with physics.
That's a good question. So when you're doing something like this, right, there is a trigonometry formula that can be used. And the reason for that is because when a lever is up and it starts to swing to the side, it's going to travel more to the side at the top than it is here, right? So 5 degrees at the top would cause more sideways, more moment arm change than a change right around here, right? So that's why trigonometry is typically, it's like, for example, a 45-degree leg press. When that sled is at a 45-degree angle, if you wanted to just be sort of like relaxed about, how much of a reduction that is, you could say half of the reduction. But in fact, a 45-degree angle results in about a 75% of the load. In other words, a 25% reduction. So when a lever moves through that arc, the degrees that it changes are not even, right? It's more in the beginning and less at the end. But the fact is that as it moves from the neutral position to the horizontal position, every single degree of change increases more, most. Less, least, right? So that is constant, right? Do we need to know that it's slightly more in the beginning and slightly less at the end? Not necessarily, and I'll show you exactly why. But this is why I don't want people who are learning how to lift weights to feel that this is too burdensome, and so it's not worth knowing, right? The take-home message is simple, that the closer it is to perpendicular, the better for you. The closer it is to vertical, the less good it is for you, the less efficient it is for you, the less percentage of the weight that you're actually lifting is loading your target muscle. So down there in the red, you'll see there that what I'm saying is there's two ways of loading a muscle with 90 pounds of resistance. You can load it with an exercise that gives you 90% of 100 pounds, or you can load it with an exercise that gives you 30% of 300 pounds. Both result in 90 pounds of resistance to the muscle, right? The muscle doesn't know or care whether it's 100 pounds or 300 pounds you're lifting. All it knows, all it senses is it's getting 90 pounds of resistance. It's having to contend with 90 pounds of resistance, right? So it's more efficient to use a smarter exercise, a more strategic exercise that gives you more perpendicular resistance so that you get your 90 pounds of muscle load without overly burdening the skeleton, the joints, the spine, etc. It's just like return on investment for your dollars, right? You want the most reward with the least investment. Same with weight training. You want the most muscle load with the least wasted effort. So that's why it's important to understand the basic premise, the basics physics, that a limb that is perpendicular to the direction of resistance, be it gravity or whatever, is going to be far more efficient at loading your target muscle than one that is mostly vertical or mostly parallel with the direction of resistance. Now, there's another factor here, which we'll talk about in just a second, and that is that it also matters where in the range of motion a muscle gets more or less resistance, right? So then knowing that when that limb is perpendicular to gravity gives you the most, then you can strategically plan it so that happens more in the early stage than in the latter stage. And we'll talk about some specific exercises in just a minute. So knowing which exercises to select best requires an understanding of this perpendicular versus parallel resistance. Okay, so the question is, how can we get a reasonably good estimate of the efficiency of muscle loading, the approximate percentage of resistance a muscle is getting? The answer is yes. And here's how we do it. We know two things absolutely for certain. We know that vertical is 0. We know that horizontal is 100%. We know that unequivocally. And we know that everything in between is percentages thereof. Oop, I misspelled angles there. Oh, I did angles in between. Okay. So we're going to talk about the percentage in just a minute, but here are a couple of other reasons I mentioned why it's important to understand basic physics when we're dealing with resistance exercise. The ideal direction of anatomical motion is also determined to a significant degree by physics, right? Because all muscles pull toward their origin. So if you're moving a limb towards in a direction where there are no muscle origins for the target muscle you're intending to work, physics, logic would dictate that you're not getting full participation from that muscle, right? So meaning something else is causing, another muscle is causing it to go in that direction. If I'm the muscle origin and the limb is over there and I'm pulling over here, it's going to come toward me, right? But if that limb moves over there, I'm not doing that, or at least I'm not doing all of it. Maybe I'm doing some of it, but something else is pulling it in a direction where I'm not situated. So that's also physics. No math required. Okay, so the ideal direction of resistance for a particular target muscle is determined to a significant degree by its alignment with the target muscle. In other words, we need to understand this concept of opposite position loading, which I talked about in my last video, right? So if I want to target a muscle that is positioned, let's say at the 1 o'clock, if we're going to look at a clock, at the 1 o'clock position, I have to pull from a 7 o'clock angle. Resistance has to come from a 7 o'clock angle if the muscle I want to target is located, or if the origins are located in that 1 o'clock position. I'll give you an example of that. Let's just say you're doing a side raise and you're doing side deltoids, right? And so now you're going to do this, which we know is a front dumbbell raise. And we think we're working front deltoids, but we're actually not. And the reason why we're actually not is because the muscle that is opposite the downward pull of gravity in both of those exercises is still the side deltoid. If I move my arm up here, here's my front deltoid, but this is the muscle. The side deltoid is the muscle that is more. So that is going to be more loaded just because of the alignment between the target muscle, or the muscle that happens to be opposite resistance, if this is the muscle you want to work, the front deltoid, you need to rotate that arm around and bring your front deltoid opposite resistance, move your side deltoid away from the alignment of the resistance in order to give that front deltoid a greater percentage of the load. Physics, no math required. Opposite position loading, also known as the line of force. It's very important to choose the direction of resistance wisely, right? Because basically you can consider the direction of resistance almost like, let's say, a bullet from a gun. You can aim it. You can aim it at the target, right? So if you want to target that muscle over there, you aim it from this angle, right? If you aim it from this angle, it's going to shoot over there. It's not going to land over there. You need to aim the opposite position, the opposite resistance towards the muscle you want to target. This is also physics. So understanding these guidelines and a few others that we talk about in our book allows you, anyone, to understand how you can evaluate an exercise, whether you can say it's, we're going to do that in just a minute, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's hitting the muscle you want it to be hitting, whether the resistance is occurring in the range of motion at the time of the range of motion you want it to, which is usually the early phase. All these are just basic physics concepts. They don't require any math. Just understanding these principles helps you understand which exercises are better or worse.
So mentioning the math is wrong, or like relying his title, the math is wrong, is basically has nothing to do with what you just explained.
Well, here's the problem with, first of all, his title, his original video was Phony Physics, right? Mm-hmm. So the problem is that physics is much more than math. These concepts I just talked about right here didn't require any math, but what is more, what is least, how you can, target a particular loading of a muscle by the direction of resistance, things like that. The big premise of the Phony had to do with the math of that resistance curve. When that thing moves through that, he was basically picking on the fact that I didn't use precise trigonometry, right? But in my book, I say, and I'll show you here in just a minute, I explain from the very beginning, I do not use precise math because I don't think you need to bother yourself with that. It's too complicated. And the method that we teach, which I'll elaborate in just a moment, you'll see lots of examples of it, is good enough. Now, he would say, well, that's subjective. Good enough is, no, you'll see. It is, in fact, very practical, very effective to use this simplified formula to determine the approximate amount of load. And by the way, you don't need to establish the approximate amount of load for every exercise. All you have to do is understand one time how you can compare one exercise to the other exercise to get a sense. Once you've done that, you can go forward and for the rest of your life, favor perpendicular resistance and never again visit any kind of percentages. Once you understand that perpendicular resistance is the best and all of your exercises include it, that's it. The only reason why we talk math at all, why we talk figures at all, is only to illustrate the contrast, illustrate the difference, how much better a perpendicular resistance is against a limb versus a mostly parallel resistance. Okay, so now we've learned a few basic things. We're going to examine a few exercises. Now, the reason I've got about 7 or 8 of these, these black and white drawings with red highlights, and this is important. Most of you have probably seen drawings like this, right? And what concerns us, Mo and I, is that this is misleading. Someone who sees this and doesn't understand the things we just pointed out about active levers versus neutral levers would see this and they'd go, oh, a side plank works. The side and front deltoids, the trapezius, the obliques, the quadriceps, and the tibialis anterior. Okay, so let's look at this. We know that the deltoid is operated by the humerus. The humerus is not perpendicular to gravity. It is mostly parallel to gravity. It's almost acting as a support beam in a building, right? That means that whatever is keeping that limb in that position isn't loaded. Now, if that person was standing upright and they had their arm like that, their deltoid, if I had a weight like this, Yes, my shoulder is loaded. Why? Because this is pulling down. It's perpendicular to my humerus. But there's no perpendicular force there. It's a parallel force, mostly parallel force. So there can be no deltoid load in that particular position, nor would there be any trapezius load in that position, close to zero. I mean, not to say that this person couldn't, tense it themselves, but it's not loaded. The limb that is operating those particular muscles is not loaded because that limb is parallel to gravity. Let's look at the quadricep. The quadricep is operated by the lower leg. Now, if this person was doing a regular plank, now the force of the body weight would be trying to bend the knee, and the quadricep would have to be activated to keep the knee straight. But this is the sideways force. There's no way that this could load the quadriceps. There's just no way. There's no force being applied to the ankle. There's no force being applied to the tibia opposite the origin and the insertion alignment of the quadricep. There's nothing trying to bend the knee the way the knee typically bends. So there's no way the quadricep could be activated during that particular position. Same with the tibialis. The tibialis pulls the forefoot up. There's nothing pulling down on the forefoot. There's no load on the foot at all. It's on the side of the foot. There's no way that tibialis anterior could be working very much. Now, granted, that sideways force might be trying to bend the ankle sideways, right? And so there might be a little bit of force on that tibialis to try to keep that ankle from bending, but it's a fraction of what it would be in comparison. The tibialis anterior mostly raises the forefoot, right? So yes, of course, there's oblique load. It's isometric, which isn't the best, but yes, that is in fact loaded. But that's about it right there. And by the way, this also creates a significant side force, a sideways force on that lower leg, which of course is now sort of trying to bend your knee sideways. That's not exactly healthy. If you've got any kind of instability in the knee, that is not a good exercise for your knee. And by the way, this thing that they're doing right here could easily be done isometrically just by holding a cable without straining the shoulder joint, without straining the sideways bending of the knee joint, right? So not to mention the fact that if you were doing an isometric, I guess you could call it a side plank, it's not really a side bend because there's no bending. If you did an isometric movement with a cable like this, right, you could choose the weight you want. This is body weight or nothing. Now, for those of us that, let's say, are young enough and have healthy enough shoulder joints, pushing your torso weight into your humerus might present no shoulder discomfort. But if you're 70 years old, 80 years old, if you've ever had a shoulder injury, jamming your torso weight into your humeral head could be extremely uncomfortable. And of course, extremely unnecessary because all you're trying to do is load the obliques. You don't need to jam your humerus into your shoulder joint. You don't need to apply sideways force on your knee joint. All you're trying to do is create an isometric force on your obliques, and you can do that much more comfortably, much more easily, and much more precisely with a precise amount of resistance that's comfortable for you just by holding onto a cable that's loaded. Now, we recommend that you have a little bit of movement because dynamic tension is always better than isometric tension. Not too much. I'm not saying overbend the spine, but you'd be much better off doing an exercise where you have a cable pulling you sideways and you're doing a little bit of dynamic spinal flexion and you eliminate all of this unnecessary shoulder jamming and the sideways knee pressure. Let's look at the next one. Okay, so now this is obviously a free weight squat. The first thing I want you to look at is the picture on the left. The quadriceps are highlighted. The quadriceps are not working then. Right now, someone who doesn't understand what we just explained about active levers and neutral levers might come to the conclusion that this person's quadriceps are loaded while he's just standing there. They are not loaded yet. They will be loaded to a degree once his lower leg tips forward, but they are not loaded at all there. Now you can sort of see on that image on the left that there's also some highlight going on in the gluteus, right? But again, the gluteus can't be loaded either because the femur is the operating lever of the gluteus and it's also vertical. It's also neutral in the neutral position at that point. Now he's holding his arms up, right? Now his arms are perpendicular with resistance. Now they're not loaded. He's not holding a weight, but that is the deltoids that's keeping his arms up. That's the only muscle primarily. I mean, some trapezius, of course, but the deltoids are the only, and they're not highlighted. So knowing this thing, this concept of neutral levers and active levers, fully active levers, and percentages in between allows you to understand what is wrong with that illustration on the left. Now you look at the illustration on the right. So you'll also see there, they've highlighted the soleus a little bit. There's a little bit of pink, not really red, a little bit of pink there in the soleus. And of course, what we know is that the soleus is activated when the load is low. The gastrocnemius is loaded when the load is high. That's what studies have shown. So it's true that there is some soleus activation. Now, of course, there wouldn't be if he rocked back onto his heels and he applied none of his body weight onto his forefoot, right? But there's probably some pressure that his forefoot is applying to the ground. So yes, there's a little bit of but it's hardly worth mentioning. What is interesting, though, is that they're highlighting the soleus, even though it's got a very, very small amount of activation. But they're not distinguishing between the amount of quadricep load that he's getting as a percentage, right? So when you do a squat like this, your tibia, which is the operating lever of the quadricep, tips forward about 30 degrees, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on your limb length, but it's certainly not horizontal. In fact, it rarely even gets to a 40 or 45 degree angle, right? So you're getting a lesser percentage of the load than you could be getting. That's the other problem I have with these drawings, is that it sort of makes it look like it's black and white, like the switch is either on or off, like you're either getting full load or no load. You're getting full 100% activation or none, right? And it's just not like that. It is degrees of loading. It is percentages of loading. And this is determined to a great degree by the angle of the limb being operated by that target muscle relative to the direction of the resistance. Okay, so, and by the way, you also can't see his back, but when he's standing upright, his torso is vertical. As soon as he dips down, his torso will dip forward. There will be some activation of the erector spinae to keep that torso from falling farther forward. You can't see it there, but if you didn't know any of this stuff and you didn't know a little bit of anatomy, you would just think, oh, if I do squats, I'm going to work my quadriceps, even if I'm just standing there. My gluteus, even if I'm just standing there. My soleus is activated apparently more than my deltoids, even though that doesn't make any logical sense once you understand the physics of these levers, right? So that's why physics is the name of our book and of the course. The physics of resistance exercise, the physics of fitness, implies the rules that determine what's neutral, what's loaded, and degrees of loading in terms of percentage. All right, so now we're looking at a parallel bar dip. So the image on the left, you'll see has highlighted front deltoids and pecs. But again, his arm is completely vertical in that position. The arms, the upper arm and the forearms, they're just at that point a support beam. There's no way the pectorals and the front deltoids could be loaded much, if at all, as long as his arms are vertical and parallel to gravity. They're in the neutral position. The muscles that are operating those limbs, therefore, would be loaded very little, if at all. Now we move to the picture on the right, and what we see there is it appears that his pectoral, his entire pectoral region is highlighted, indicating that it's fully loaded. The front deltoids appear to be fully loaded, and the triceps appear to be fully loaded. But here's what's interesting is look at the forearm angle of the image on the right. Not only is it not tipping back, it's not even vertical. It's actually tipping a little bit forward. So that's not actually a very good representation. It's unlikely anyone would actually do a parallel bar dip with a forearm angling slightly. You could do it. I mean, it's almost like what a gymnast would do, right? When they do with the rings, you could do it, but it's not likely anyone would actually try to do that. But what I want to say is look at the front deltoid. The front deltoid appears to be lit. It appears to be firing. If you just saw that one drawing, you would think, oh, that must be a good front deltoid exercise. What it's not telling you is a couple of things that are very important. It's telling what the math tells us, right? What the physics tells us is that the front deltoid will be the most loaded muscle of any of the others involved. It'll be more loaded than the chest and more loaded than the triceps. And the reason for that is because the pathway that the upper arm, the humerus, which is the operating lever of the front deltoid, is traveling away from the origin of the front deltoid and then toward it, right? It's not moving away from the sternum and toward the sternum. as would be the most ideal pathway for the pectorals, it's moving along the pathway of the front deltoid. And the front deltoid is arguably weaker than the pecs, right? So not only is the alignment of a parallel bar dip going to load the front deltoids more, but it's a weaker muscle than the pectoral muscle. So you'll notice, I'm sure you've noticed, that when you do a parallel bar dip, the front deltoids feel super loaded. And you're going, when you go deep, you're getting into a really, really extreme stretch, far more stretch than is reasonably good from front deltoid. When you finish with your arm alongside your body. Does your front deltoid finish its range of motion, its contraction there? No, it does not. It finishes it somewhere right around here. So it's too far on the stretch and not far enough on the contraction. None of that is being informed to you by these drawings. If you just saw these drawings, you would think, oh, if I do parallel bar dips, I'm going to get full tricep contraction, full front deltoid contraction. And by the way, to the capacity of each muscle, right? The capacity of the pecs is greater than the capacity of the front deltoid. So how could it be that the pecs are going to be as loaded as much as the front deltoid? It's just impossible. They have a greater capacity. In other words, the front deltoids are the weak link in this exercise right here. And again, the forearm being vertical would indicate that it's the bicep or the tricep are operating the forearm. There's just no way with a vertical forearm that you're going to get much load, if any, with a vertical forearm on the triceps. All right. So now let's look at this exercise. So these are all very good for you to sort of use as sort of a test, as a way of sort of like checking to see what we just learned about vertical and perpendicular and horizontal in terms of what's being loaded and what's not. So I'm sure most of you, if not all of you in the audience right now, have done a tricep kickback. And all of you have discovered that when your forearm is hanging straight down, it's very easy. When you extend, it's very hard, right? So it's easy here because your forearm is vertical. It's in the neutral position. It's not loading the tricep at all. It can't. It's just hanging like that pendulum, right? As you extend it and it gets more horizontal and more perpendicular resistance, it loads the muscle more because now it is a fully active lever. But if you look at the illustration on the left, you'll see that the forearm is not vertical. It's on this side of the elbow instead of that side of the elbow. And what that means is that now either the dumbbell arrived there because it's swung there, or the bicep is actually pulling it there, right? And yet there's no highlight on the bicep, right? So that's a mistake in the drawing. And there's no way that the tricep could be working with the forearm at that angle. Zero. It wouldn't even be working if that forearm was just hanging straight down. It's working even less when it's on this side of the elbow. And the reason for that is because of reciprocal inhibition, which means as soon as you activate your bicep, we're going to assume that this person didn't swing it down into that position, that he's sort of pulling it into that position. As soon as the bicep gets activated, the tricep deactivates, right? This is the central nervous system doing its job to prevent interference with its own activity, right? So either the tricep or the bicep is going to fire at a particular time. If the bicep brought the dumbbell there, the tricep is going to shut off. Okay, the illustration on the right there, that's basically showing correctly that the tricep is going to be fully activated when the forearm is parallel to the ground. But what this particular drawing isn't informing you of is the resistance curve, that the tricep, like most muscles, will benefit more by having early phase loading. In other words, when you're doing, let's say, a skull crusher, if you're doing this, when your forearms are bent, when your elbows are bent and your forearms are parallel to the ground, your tricep is more elongated and it's stronger. And since this is horizontal, it's more loading the tricep when it's stronger. And as you extend and the forearms become more vertical, the resistance diminishes. As the muscle contracts, it loses strength potential. It gets a little weaker. So it's convenient to do an exercise that gives you more when you can afford more and less when you can afford less. Tricep kickback is the opposite of that. Now, if you didn't know that, and all you saw was this drawing right here, you would say, oh, the tricep kickback is a good exercise. In fact, it's compromised. Is it bad? Well, it's not bad. It's better than sitting on the couch eating potato chips, but it's not as good as an early phase loaded exercise. And there's just no possible way that the illustration on the left could happen, could be real, could be authentic. There's no way you could load your tricep with your forearm in that angle relative to gravity. All right, so now let's just compare these two. We already know that when your forearm is vertical on a tricep kickback, that your tricep is unloaded. And yet, why would we think that it would be loaded when that forearm is in the exact same angle on parallel bar dips? Now, in this particular drawing, as I said, it's unrealistic that anyone's going to do a parallel bar dip with their forearm actually tilting forward. You'll see here in just a minute, there's a lot of people that use an almost perfectly vertical forearm, but the important thing to know is the more vertical it is, the more neutral the triceps are. The more horizontal the forearm is, the more activated, the bigger the percentage of the load the triceps are getting. So when you're doing parallel bar dips, you'll never get a horizontal forearm, as you'll see here in just a minute. But this is just basic physics, basic classical mechanics. There's just no way that you can understand that tricep kickbacks doesn't load your triceps when the forearm is hanging vertically, and at the same time think that you're getting a lot of load on your triceps when you're doing parallel bar dips, even though the forearm is almost in the exact same angle. All right, so what's wrong with this picture? Again, they've highlighted anterior deltoids, they've highlighted pectorals, they've highlighted obliques and abdominals. That's correct. They've highlighted hip flexors. That's correct. They've highlighted quadriceps. That's correct. They've highlighted tibialis anterior. That's not correct. Why? Because again, the foot is now vertical. It's not, there's nothing that's trying to push the forefoot down away from the head of the body. That would cause the tibialis anterior to pull upward to prevent that from happening. This is just basically the foot is acting as a support beam right there. There's no way the tibialis anterior could be loaded much, if at all. The quadricep is loaded isometrically to prevent the knee from buckling, from bending. Hip flexors are activated to keep the pelvis up, the hip up. And of course, the obliques and the rectus abdominis are loaded because they're keeping the bridge from collapsing, right? But there's no way the front deltoid and the pectorals could be loaded because their lever, which is that humerus, is in the vertical position. It is acting as a support beam. And so everything operating that limb is going to be neutral. It's going to be not loaded. Of course, here I'm talking about isometric versus dynamic. That's the other problem. And when we're talking about biomechanics, the issue of isometric versus dynamic does come into the picture. In other words, biomechanics is mechanics, but it's also biology. So it's important to understand the difference between isometric and dynamic. Now, exercise physiologists typically understand isometric versus dynamic. And so there's a little bit of crossover between exercise physiology and biomechanics. But whereas an exercise physiologist knows a lot more about the physiology of muscle contraction, they know less about the physics and the anatomy and the direction of resistance than does a biomechanist, right? But the biomechanist typically knows less about the physiology. So it's important for these two segments to understand what each of them contributes and what each one of them doesn't contribute. Okay, so now here, this is an article on the website. It's a friend of mine, Demont Indrayan, and what he's explaining here is the difference in the angle of the push-up in terms of load. So what you'll see there at the top is that when you have your regular push-up, your feet are on the ground, it says there that you're getting about 64% of your body weight loading your pectorals, triceps, shoulders, the muscles that are moving the upper portion of the body, right? Then you use a box and you get 55%. You use a higher box, you get 41%. Now you switch it, you put the box on the feet, you get 70%, higher box 74%, on your knees 49%. So the take-home message here is the more of your body weight that's angling up, the less you get. The more of your body weight that's angling down, the more you get. Now, percentages are math. Wouldn't it be interesting if Kassem says, well, gee, I wonder if these percentages are accurate here. Let's do the math on these things. Let's try to, debunk what Demont Indrayan is trying to say here. That would be foolish. We don't need to know whether it's 64% or 61%. We don't need to know whether it's 55% or 48%. The take-home message is what's more and what's less, and how you can shift more or less by changing angles of limbs, angles of torso. That's the same as what we're doing. We're talking about the effect of changing the direction of resistance relative to the limb that is used by your target muscle, right? It doesn't matter whether it's 64% or 59%. What matters is the bottom line, loading efficiency. That's what matters. You need to know what will be most efficient to load your target muscle so that you can do the most with the least. So now we're going to review, now that we've got some of these basics covered, we're going to review Kassem's original video. His video was called Phony Physics, right? So the first thing that everyone needs to understand is, and I'll show you here in just a minute, he said he read my book. He said he's bought the whole course. If that's true, and we should take him at his word, I guess, he saw the disclaimer, which says clearly, this is not meant to be accurate math, because we don't want people to think that they have to use math to work out, to determine what's better or what's worse, right? And so the idea that you would nitpick whether or not the math is correct was ridiculous. So here it is. He says the fact that these models are claimed as absolute facts. No, I never did. There it is right there. For the sake of discussion, this position is going to be called the 50. I was talking about a 45-degree angle, a 50% position, although a trigonometry calculation would reveal a slightly different number. Keep in mind that the underlying purpose of this book is to gain a broad understanding of resistance exercise. It is not to learn trigonometry. Then, in a different disclaimer, shortly before or after that, it says the following calculation is a simplified formula. The exact calculation requires trigonometry, which is not necessary for our purposes. The simplified method is accurate enough to give you a sense of how this particular exercise compares to another exercise. So, frankly, I thought it was a terrible, terrible, terrible trick to say that I was using fake physics, when in fact, from the very beginning, I've said all along, this is not meant to be accurate. And as you'll see, I mean, as I said, I've said it's effective enough. He says, well, that's subjective. You'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. So there it is. I've made it clear that I use a simple method of measuring a limb's percentage of distance from the neutral position or from the fully active position. So in addition to the above misrepresentation, Kassem then assailed my ethics and said I was disrespectful to others in the field by not using accurate physics, and said I'm not even qualified to present on the topic. Well, first of all, let me just say that, again, I never said from the beginning that it's supposed to be accurate math. That's number one. And he should have known that. That's number one. Number two is the people that he says I'm being disrespectful to in the field. A lot of these people are on board with me. A lot of these people endorsed my book. Frankly, the field of biomechanics is extremely niche. Tom Purvis was probably the first person about 30 years ago that started shining a light on the physics involved in resistance exercise. And there's been very, very, very few people that have done similar work. So there's not a lot of biomechanists out there that are familiar with the biomechanical nuances of resistance exercise. So what I have here is 3 university biomechanics books. If you were to sign up for a biomechanics class at a university, it's highly unlikely that much time would be spent talking about biomechanics as applied to resistance exercise. They'll apply it to sport. They'll say, okay, when you're pole vaulting, you've got a certain amount of speed going, you drop your pole into the hole, you bend that pole, you swing your body weight forward. As you swing, the pole bends more. And as you bring your feet up, you let the pole straighten out and it launches you over the top. This is all physics and biomechanics. But what does it tell you about what is the most effective way to work the pectorals? What does it tell you about what's safe or not safe for the biceps? in terms of working the biceps? Very little, right? So the fact is there's very, very little light being shown on this particular field of biomechanics. So when Kassem says it's disrespectful to those in the field, there's very few in the field, unfortunately. There's a lot of exercise physiologists out there. But my Wayne Westcott, one of the endorsers of my book, admitted that there's very little physics and biomechanics taught in a typical curriculum at a university of exercise science. One of my other endorsers is a biological engineer. So he actually makes robotics, medical robotics. Now he does know mechanics because that's his specialty. And we consult frequently. But his focus, again, isn't on resistance exercise. He does know forces, what's more, what's less, and why. He does understand all of that better than an exercise physiologist would. But he doesn't understand how that mixes with physiology and anatomy and neurology so that you can then decide which exercises are better or worse. That's a very, very, very small field. So there are not a lot of people. So it is ridiculous to say that I'm not being respectful to other biomechanists in the field because, frankly, there's very, very few out there.
Doug, let me ask you a question quickly,
Yeah.
since we're talking about this. Maybe some people want to know this. Who you think or who you like in terms of someone who's teaching biomechanics?
Well, Tom Purvis is the leader. And the problem is, and most of us have not heard from Tom in a long time. I actually reached out to him and sent him an email, and we've communicated in the past, and he has disappeared. I've not seen any videos of his. He's not posting anything new. His all of his social media has been sort of inactive. I hope he's okay. I don't know. And as you'll see here, I reference him later. I've been a fan of his for over 30 years, and I've never disagreed with anything he has said. It's always made perfectly good sense to me. Everything that I've said is not in conflict with anything that I've heard him say. So, he has my utmost respect. Even though his let's say focus has been more general fitness and more in terms of, let's say, physical therapy, but less in the application of muscle building, right? Because he comes more from a physical therapy background. But still, nevertheless, he understands the forces. He understands the physics better than anyone I've ever seen. I would not hesitate for a second to have a conversation with him. The problem is, look, someone like Mike Israetel or Wayne Westcott, they might have certain beliefs and certain biases that, let's say, might be in conflict with some of the things I teach, but I think they're reasonable people, and I have no problem sitting in a room with them, having a conversation and exchanging ideas. And I think they would listen. The problem with Kassem is he doesn't listen. He wants you to believe what he wants you to believe. I'll point some things out later. He will refute anything you say. And he's refuted all of my endorsers. Let me explain something about my endorsers. In my book, I talk about a lot of things. I talk about human evolution, why it is that the human musculoskeletal system is designed the way it is right now, and what that tells us about which exercises would be most effective and most safe based on what could be considered natural or unnatural movement, right? In other words, certain movements were certainly done through our evolutionary time. Certain movements were not. There's no reason why, let's say, if you're going to do an overhead press and you want to believe that that's a perfectly natural movement, we have to somehow grasp the idea that cavemen did this on a regular basis and that they needed to do it for their survival, right? There's no reason why a straight vertical movement would be consistent with survival. Now, certainly, we did some climbing, right? But climbing was still not from here. It was still mostly from in front, and it was pulling instead of pushing. So the mechanics is different. Pulling is, in fact, safer than pushing overhead. So that's why we have an anthropologist endorsing our book to corroborate that what I say about natural movement and unnatural movement is correct. He's not there to corroborate the physics, right? We have a neurologist. He's not there to corroborate the physics. He's there to corroborate the neurological things that I talk about. We have a psychology PhD. We have a sociology PhD, not to corroborate the physics, to corroborate the things I talk about in terms of mindsets, in terms of preferences, in terms of biases, why it is that we have such an obsession with lifting heavy amounts of weight rather than focusing on efficiency of loading, right? In other words, you know, earlier I showed you that thing that you can get 90 pounds of resistance with 300 pounds or with 100 pounds, right? But the typical mindset is I'm going to lift 300 pounds because it's probably more effective. Well, if you knew that the muscle loading was possibly no greater than 100 pounds with a better exercise, you might choose otherwise. But humans are humans. Humans have this, you know, machismo or, you know, competitive nature. And so we want to be able to lift an impressive amount of weight. We want to post it on our social media. We want people to see us as if we're in beast mode. And so people tend to prefer the exercises which allow them to lift a heavier weight, not knowing that when you do the math on these things, you actually find out that they're giving you less load or no more load than you could get with a lesser weight, but better mechanics. So that's why those PhD endorsers are endorsing my book. They're not there to corroborate the physics. And then he pokes fun at the NASA guy. Well, the NASA guy is an astrophysicist, right? That means he's about 8, 10, 12 notches above a regular physics professor. But he had to go through classical mechanics to get there, right? So he corroborates the classical mechanics. Now, we didn't get I also work with some structural engineers, PhDs. They didn't actually endorse the book because they didn't meet them until slightly later, but they've also corroborated that everything I've said is correct. So as I'll mention later, you know, Kassem is a politician. He tries to basically refute anything and everything and finds a little bullshit excuse. And I'll show you some exact examples of that in just a minute. So you'll see that he is not to be trusted with his criticisms. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So what I want to say here is, you know, he's trying to frame this as a simple debate. Oh, now Brignole is attacking me. He's trying to defame me. It's like, dude, this was slander from the beginning. This was not.
He was in the comment section. He's saying, I'm sending this before the video even starting. He's defending himself before the video even started.
Look, he knew from the beginning this was an attempt to discredit me completely, right? This was not like a concerned scientist trying to point out legitimate things that really matter. This was a person who was trying to basically contrive reasons or make-believe reasons to try to find something to discredit me.
And he's sending people also to comment the same way he's commenting. And it's so obvious, like it's ridiculous.
So this is what he started. He started with the idea that I'm going to try to discredit Brignole. Now I'm going to try to go through all of his material and find things to criticize to convince the audience that what I'm saying is correct. So this is what he says. Doug claims a shin angle of 30 degrees in a squat gives you 1/3 the load magnification you would get in a leg extension. That is incorrect. That's what he said. Okay, so that's when he starts to show these figures and tries to show this math and blah, blah. But the fact is, scales don't lie. There is a balance scale, and there is a 30-degree lever on the left and a horizontal or a perpendicular resistance lever on the right, and you see it's a 3-to-1 ratio. Now you can parse the numbers any way you want. You can say the math is this, the math is that. The scale is the simplest way to show what's what. Now keep in mind, 30 degrees is 1/3 the distance of the 90 degrees, right? 3-to-1. So to say that 1/3, that a 30-degree angle is 33% active, as opposed to being 100% active, is not false, as proven by the balance scale. It is basically 3-to-1 loading efficiency.
What do you say that the scale doesn't represent the whole body?
Well, I'll address this later, but I might as well throw that out now. Look, the forearm, the upper arm, the lower leg, the femur, these are all limbs, right? So when I use a balance scale, what I'm actually showing you is all other factors being equal. In other words, everything else being constant, the variable is the angle of the limb. So it's important to say, let's say, for example, you're comparing a squat. Well, here it is right here. You're comparing a squat to a leg extension. And you say, well, a leg extension gets a perpendicular application of force with the roller right against the ankle. Perpendicular is 100%. Right? Now you're doing a squat, you're getting a 30% ground reaction force pushing against the foot. The foot is about 4 inches lower, 5 inches lower than the ankle. So in that sense, you could say, yeah, but the lever length is different. Well, the lever length is different, but the question then becomes is, which would be better? Would it be better to have a slightly shorter limb with a perpendicular force or a slightly longer limb with a 30-degree direction of resistance, right? And obviously, or it should be obvious, that you can't compensate for a 60% reduction of the force with only a 3 to 5% extension of the lever length. It's just not enough, right? If it was 2 or 3 times the length, maybe, right? But you're taught. And by the way, it's also important to understand that regardless of limb lengthening, he's going to try to say, yeah, but it depends how tall you are. It's like, no, dude, it doesn't matter how tall you are, whether you're short, whether you're tall. A non-perpendicular application of force is going to be less efficient, less productive for you, the tall person, you, the short person, than would be a perpendicular application of resistance. In other words, it would be wrong to say if you're short, you're better off having a perpendicular resistance, but if you're tall, you're better off having a 30% direction of resistance. No, everyone would benefit more by having a perpendicular application of resistance because that constitutes 100% of the available resistance. It's much more efficient. There's no reduction. There's no loss. So here, this is something else. Here, he's talking about how, and he says it's a big flaw. He says when you're doing a leg extension, you're only dealing with the tibia. When you're dealing with, he actually says a hack squat or a pendulum squat, but they're basically the same. Any kind of squat, he says, involves the femur. It does not involve the femur at all. The femur is doing what the glute needs. So let me give you a perspective on it. Let's just say that you're watching someone do a sissy squat, right? You know what a sissy squat looks like. You know what? They're doing it from the side. And you can see that it's all quadricep. There's no glute involved in that at all. Now, you may not know quite why, right? But it has to do with the fact that the torso is leaning to the back side of the hips. It's not leaning to the front side of the hips. That's part of it. And the other part of it is that the width, the moment arm of the tibia is wider at that point than the moment arm of the femur. So let's just say that this person you're watching do a sissy squat then starts to shift his hips back just a little bit. Not all the way back, just a little bit. Just enough to go so that instead of being on the behind the heels, it's right above the heels, right? Now his moment arm of the tibia is equal to the moment arm of the femur, which means that the quadriceps still don't have any load because they're actually just being replaced by the femur, by the tibia. Then he sticks his ass out farther. And you can see now, if you draw a line straight up from the heel, you can see that he's got a little bit of femur on the rear of his heels, and let's say 2/3 or half in front of the, so now he's getting gluteus load, but he's getting gluteus load with a shorter lever. But none of these work as a loader, the femur, as a loader of the quadricep. So this is just nonsense. And he knows that most people won't understand that it's nonsense, right? But it's just confusing and fills the air. And so he basically, who's going to refute this, he says? Who's going to know to refute this, right? It's going to make it look like I know more than Doug. The fact is, it's false. There's just no way. Now, I explained in my previous video, if you do a sissy squat on a sissy squat bench and you stabilize the lower leg, and then you let the femur go up and down, now femur length matters. Now femur length, femur is the operating lever of because now you've reversed, you've changed the direction of resistance from linear to rotational, right? So now you've changed the mechanics, and now, yes, the femur is acting as the loading arm, and the degree to which you take your torso and lean it either forward or back from the end of your femur, you'll either add to femur length or you'll subtract from femur length by tipping your torso. But that, yes, that would matter, but it does not matter. The femur plays no role whatsoever on a regular linear force squat.
And he didn't explain that to his audience, and he didn't explain like which math he's referring to that is right. He's just like talking.
Look, you'll see other examples here. He does this a lot. He just fills the air with either false information or irrelevant information, and it makes it sound to the naive person, to the uneducated, that, you know, he seems to know what he's talking about. But you'll see here other examples. It's just glaringly false. So here's, I was referring to this earlier. He says, you know, and this is another big flaw, that the leg extension hits the tibia 75% of the way down. The fact is, you can put that roller anywhere you want. You can put it 75% down your tibia if you want. You can put it lower. You can put it on your forefoot if you want. You can put it mid shin if you want. You can put it anywhere you want. So the first mistake with that is to assume that the roller will always be, quote unquote, too high on the tibia, right? But the bottom line is, you can see there in my illustration, the red arrow. The red arrow is approximately where that roller would hit the tibia, perpendicular to the lower leg, and the black arrow shows what it would be. So you would be much better off having a slightly shorter application of resistance that's perpendicular to the lower leg than a slightly longer lower leg, meaning you're applying the force to the foot, but it's only at a 30-degree angle, which is not even going to give you half of the available resistance. Okay. So now this is sort of interesting. Now it gets really, really sort of, I think, almost funny. He says that Doug claims that a 10% angle forearm during dips gives you 11% of the load, right? So there he says it's actually closer to double. So what he means by closer to double is that it's going, he's going to say that it's 18 degrees of tilt, not 10 degrees of tilt, which of course is almost double, closer to double, right? So hold that in mind. And then he also says that Doug's math was off by a factor of 100%. Okay, so this is interesting. You'll find, I find this very amusing. Okay, the first thing I'll say here is that he says that the 18 degrees creates a moment arm roughly 3 times Doug's example. Now, for those of you that don't know what a moment arm is, the moment arm is the width, the distance from the pivot or from the application of force, right? So the first thing I say is even a 20-degree forearm, in other words, I'm giving him 2 more degrees, does not create a moment arm that is 3 times wider. So what you have there is a protractor on the right. That's my drawing, right? So the dotted line at the 90-degree mark shows where you start. The green line that's there is the 10 degrees. That's where I say that's the width of where the elbow would go. The elbow, the mechanical part of the elbow would go when you dip down, right? You see a 2 there. The 2 is slightly sooner than the blue line. The blue line is 20 degrees. In other words, even if it was 20 degrees instead of the 18 degrees, he says, it's still not twice the width. The 3 there is, in fact, 3 times the moment arm. And you could see how far that is on the scale. You'd be talking about a 58-degree angle, which is, you know, considerably farther than a forearm could ever possibly go. It is impossible to have a 3-time greater moment arm than what I say at 10 degrees. Now let's get a closer look at this. So 18 is only 8 more than 10, right? So even if you went in a straight line and you said, okay, the red arrow is from 0 to 10 degrees, the black line is to 18 degrees, that's 1.8 times more moment arm. Not 3 times, only 1.8. I mean, logically speaking, how could he possibly say that 18 creates 3 times the moment arm when it's only 0.8 more? It's not even 2 times more. And this is a straight line. In other words, when you actually curve down, you lose some of that. So you end up with a 1.6, 1.5 greater moment arm at 18 degrees, if in fact 18 degrees is the right number, which we'll look at in just a minute. But this is interesting because he says Doug uses phony physics, when here he is trying to say to you, the audience, that that a tilt of 18 degrees creates a moment arm that is 3 times the 10 degrees Doug says. Plainly false, plainly deceptive. I mean, look, this isn't a mistake. This is a lie. It's as simple as that. You'll see more of it. So a moment arm that is actually 3 times my model would require a 28-degree tilt from vertical. Have you ever seen anyone do parallel bar dips with a 28-degree angle forearm?
On Muscle and Motion, they will show the forearm goes this way.
Yeah, I saw that. And that was actually, I saw that. And that was actually not a parallel bar dip. That was a dip with your feet out in front. In other words, you could do it. If you had like those dip bars that are close to the ground, and you had most of your weight or some of your weight suspended by your feet out in front of you, you could manage it. But if you're hanging straight down, unassisted, meaning without putting your feet anywhere, it'd be really, really, really difficult to get a forearm at 28-degree angle without overloading it. It's just too difficult. But you'll see here in just a minute. But again, this is deception. So let's get a closer look at this. The green line there again is the actual 10-degree forearm tilt that I believe happens most of the time. The blue line with the 2 shows what a double, twice as much magnification moment arm would look like. And the small red dot with the dotted line is where he says the 18 degrees is, right? Which means 18 degrees is not even twice the moment arm. And the 3-time moment arm is way over there at the 28-degree mark. 28 degrees from the neutral, which is actually 62 degrees from the top. So this is the kind of stuff that, you know, when you're listening to him in a podcast or you're listening to him in a video, you're not likely to get your protractor out and double check, right? He'll say, Doug is wrong by a factor of 100%. Doug is wrong by a factor of 3 times. And you go, oh, okay. He knows you're not going to check. Right? He may be hoping that I don't reveal this to you. This is not, look, this is fact. If you went straight out without the curve, it's still not twice as big. It certainly isn't 3 times as big. It's only 0.8 bigger. Okay, so let's look at the next one. The suggestion that the forearm tilt is 18 degrees is actually false. The angle of the forearm changes modestly. So in the first video, where we did the rebuttal, I showed you that his drawing had a line through the forearm from the skin on the inside of the wrist to the skin on the outer part of the elbow. In other words, that's not where the elbow joint is. That's not where the bone is, right? So his response to that was, oh, well, that I was just saying that because that person isn't in a fully descended position. If you do go in the fully descended position, it would go to 18 degrees. All right, so here, this person is fully descended, would we not say? Can you get any more descended than that? Probably not. Where is this forearm? 80 degrees, 10 degrees from 90. I put a dot at the 70 so you could see where his forearm would have to be if it was approaching 18, 19, 20. It's nowhere near that. It is plainly 10 degrees from vertical. Another one, fully descended. 10 degrees from vertical. Another one, 10 degrees from vertical. 2 more. On the left, 10 degrees from vertical. On the right, vertical. Another one, 10 degrees from vertical, fully descended. Another one, vertical. Now look, you can do this yourself. You can just Google parallel bar dips and look for people in a fully descended position, and you will not find anybody.
Maybe they do it in their
well, I mean, I
platform.
suppose if you wanted to, like, create that scenario, but the average person who just goes into a regular parallel bar dip does not comfortably tilt their forearm back more than about 10 degrees. Is it possible it could go 11, 12 degrees? Maybe 13? It's possible. It's not common. It's not easy. It's not likely, right? But the idea that 18 degrees is the common, the idea that 18 degrees is what everybody's forearm goes to when they descend into the, that's plainly false. Two more, 10 degrees, 10 degrees. I mean, listen, I was looking for something more. No, you find less. You find 5 degrees, you find vertical, you don't find, I didn't find a single one. I'm being sincere. I couldn't find a single one that was 12, 13 degrees, much less 18. More, 10 degrees, 10 degrees. I mean, it is, this is normal. This is common. This is what the forearm typically does. So to say 18 degrees is the usual, and then to say that 18 degrees is 3 times the moment arm of 10 degrees, those are both lies. Those are both false. So here's what I say. If a forearm were to tilt 18 degrees, as he says, it's still really inefficient as a tricep loading lever, right? So in this particular demonstration, I showed what a 20-degree lever would look like, right? So there on the left, you see a 20-degree angle lever. And on the right, you see a horizontal, not quite horizontal. It's just shy of horizontal, right? Which means the resistance is not quite So in other words, I've got 4 weights on the left and 1 weight on the right, and these are all the same, by the way, so they all weigh the same thing. If I put 1 more on the left, it might be a little bit more than I need. So it's kind of like 4.5 or 4 1/4, something like that, that I would need to counteract. So here's the thing. A 20-degree lever is 23% of the distance from between vertical and horizontal. Getting back to the math I use, right? 23% is very close to 25%. 25% is a quarter, right? What do we have there? 4 to 1. 4 to 1 ratio. So using the 23%, the distance method instead of using the trigonometry method works. It works well enough to show that it's about 1/4 as efficient as a perpendicular resistance would be on the forearm. That's the take-home message. For those of you that want to maximize your resistance, the take-home message is try to seek a mostly perpendicular resistance. Why? Because as you can see here, a mostly vertical direction of resistance will require far more weight to equal the same amount of muscle loading that you'd get with just a more strategic, better perpendicular application of resistance on the limb being operated by your target muscle. So the idea that you're going to try to, I don't know what, defend parallel bar dips because it's an 18-degree tilt and not a 10-degree tilt is ridiculous. You're still far from using an efficient tricep loading limb.
So he's 100% wrong about that.
Well, yeah, yes, he's 100% wrong. He's totally wrong about that. In other words, he's wrong about the 18 degrees. He's wrong about the 3 times greater moment arm. And he misses the point, because the point is that you're better off with a skull crusher. The point is you're better off with something, or even tricep pushdowns. You're better with something that gives you a perpendicular resistance against your forearm rather than a mostly vertical resistance against your forearm. That's the take-home message. That's the only reason why it even matters to try to quantify this stuff, right? Once you've seen the difference, the 4 to 1 ratio I'm showing you right there. And by the way, the image on the right, if you want to, you know, let's say enlarge that, screenshot that and enlarge that. I'm showing you that not only so you can see that there's 4 in one basket and 1 in the other basket. And by the way, these baskets are the same baskets. It's the same length lever arm. It's the same size, weight, carabiner. Everything is the same except the weight in the basket. In other words, all factors being equal, what is the effect of the lever angle on the efficiency of loading? And I'm also showing you there that there's a space between this and where that wing nut is. In other words, you know, heaven forbid he say, oh no, he tightened that thing up there. You know, you can see there's nothing touching it. It's completely free to tilt. And when I actually showed that on the last video, it was actually moving. So you can actually see This is a completely fair analysis here. Okay, so let's go back to this, this 100% thing. So he says that it's closer to double what I say, and that Doug's math is off by a factor of 100%. Now, we've all seen infomercials and we've all seen people throwing out figures like, you know, this thing is 320% more. Okay, well, these are tactics. So the term 100% can be used in two ways. It can be used to mean twice as much. For example, the difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees is 100%. 4 degrees is 100% more than 2 degrees, right? Because 2 degrees times 100% is 2 degrees. 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? So it doesn't matter that it's only 2 degrees different. A guy could say, Kassem would say, it's 100% more than what he said it was, even though it's only 2 degrees more than I said it was. Okay, so that's one way of using it. The other way of using it, and the way it's more often used, is to mean total or complete. So let's just say you and I are going on a drive and I say, I'm not quite sure of these directions. And you say, wait, you're not 100% sure of the directions to this place? And I go, well, I'm 95% sure. Right? Well, now we're talking about totality, right? So this is why he's using the 100%. When he says Doug is off by a factor of 100%, it sounds like he's saying Doug is 100% wrong, but that's not actually what he's saying. So Kassem's statement that I'm 100%, the factor of 100% is insignificant if you're talking about 10 degrees versus 18 degrees, because either way, the form is still far from horizontal. The form would actually have to be 800% to 900% more than the 10 degrees of a form tilt in dips in order to qualify as efficient, fully efficient. In other words, if you're at 10 degrees and you go 800% or 900% more, you get to 10 degrees or horizontal. That's where it has to be, right? So to say that, you know, it's 100% more, even if it was 100% more, we're talking about the difference between 10 degrees and 20 degrees. 20 degrees is still shit in terms of efficiency. If you were going to load a muscle, you don't want the limb that's operating that muscle to only have 20% efficiency, meaning 80% reduction of magnification. You don't want that. You want full magnification so that you don't have to use more weight than necessary and you get maximum load. So this is another way he's just trying to color it to make it look like, you know, Doug is really wrong. It's like, no, it is in fact 10 degrees. And even if it were 18 degrees, 18 is only 1.8 times more, not 3 times more than 10 degrees. And even if it were 20 degrees, it's still far from efficient. Strike 3. So declaring that I use phony physics by construing the forearm angle to be at 18 degrees is meaningless because it's splitting hairs. The point, again, as I'm just repeating myself, the point of using any method to approximate degrees of muscle loading is to establish what is most efficient and what is least efficient. That is not phony. That's accurate and it's reasonable and it's valuable to you to understand how you can better select exercises, to stay away from exercises that have low efficiency loading. That's the point. Sort of, you know, to split hairs about 10 degrees versus 18 degrees, it's ridiculous. So Kassem wants his audience to believe that he is generally concerned about the community, but that's obviously false, right? So you don't protect the community by lying about the degree of tilt of the forearm, by lying about the 3 times magnification, you know, all of these things. He's not doing a community service by protecting people from what? From, you know, thinking that, you know, dips are actually good for the triceps. That protects the community. Dude, you're gonna be better off with a skull crusher or cable extension or something where you get a perpendicular application of resistance against the form, period. So these are all the things that he has said. He says that my math is not right, but he's lying about his own. He said, I'm not qualified. He said, I'm disrespectful to other biomechanists in the field. He says that the 13 PhDs and MD endorsers that endorse my book don't know what correct is. He says that the people that are followers, the people that are using our methods, that they don't know enough. Right. So here's one thing that he says, which I think is sort of funny. He'll say, well, if you take someone who's been training really bad and you give them, an exercise that's half good, they'll think it's great. It's like, yeah, but these aren't people that are just beginners. I mean, look at Renzo Algieri. Renzo was on the world championship stage with me, the NABO World Championship with me on stage in 2014. This is a veteran competitive bodybuilder that had done all the heavy traditional lifts. He'd done the deadlifts, he'd done the squats, he'd done parallel bar dips, he's done everything, right? Thor from Norway, another one, veteran competitive bodybuilder. Everton, I think his name, Rick Everton. These are competitive bodybuilders, right? So, it almost doesn't matter what I say. He's going to try to diminish the endorsers, the followers, the people that are raving about the good results they're getting. Even the people who say it feels better than anything else. Well, he'll say deception. Excuse me. He'll say sensation is deceiving. You can't tell what an exercise is good by how it feels. Well, what does that mean? When he says you can't tell whether an exercise is good by how it feels, he's basically saying you can't rely on anything other than what I'm telling you. You need me. It doesn't matter if your muscle is actually growing. It doesn't matter if the exercise feels right. It doesn't matter if you're believing the word of these, PhD endorsers. None of that matters. You have to dismiss all of that. The only thing you can believe is what I tell you. Well, it's exactly what he wants you to believe, that you need him because everything else is an illusion. That's a politician. That's what politicians do. By the way, that's also what an attorney does if he's trying to defend, let's say, a murderer, right? Let's just say he's defending O.J. Simpson. He'll construe a story and he'll throw up so many smoke screens that the jury is just confused and, okay, maybe he didn't do it. Well, this is what you do when you're a manipulator. This is exactly what you do. And again, as I say there at the bottom, this is not an unbiased scholarly assessment. This is political. This is personal. He's not fair-minded. He's not, by the way, Mike Israetel, which did a video that was critical of me, but he did not do any of this stuff. Mike Israetel is a reasonable man. He's a reasonable, intelligent man. He may have some preferences. He may have some biases. He may be absent some information that I could help him understand and we could have a conversation. And we intend to. But what Kassem is doing here is not respectable. It's not reasonable. It's not fair-minded. It is completely political. So as I said, he knew that from the beginning that I don't use precise math. And I showed you from the scales there that you can use the 23% and still come up with a 4-to-1 ratio on the scale. It's close enough. And I say approximating the amount of muscle load is purely academic. We don't need to do this all the time. We just need to do it to demonstrate the difference between vertical and horizontal. And our primary message is to understand what qualifies as a more efficient exercise versus a less efficient exercise. And this is valuable. And he's never once mentioned that, right? He's trying to, find, numerical things to criticize, but it doesn't come close to talking about efficiency. How do we know what's efficient? Opposite position loading, perpendicular resistance. These things matter. So in regards to defining a moment arm, now in the last video, I made a correction and you could say I was wrong about that. Kassem apparently uses a bar drawn perpendicularly from the point where the load is applied. In that sense, perpendicular would be the correct term to use. So I do concede that. And I do apologize for that because that is one method. That is his method of identifying the moment arm. I don't use that. And as you saw in my other examples, I use parallel lines drawn parallel to the direction of resistance where the pivot is and where the resistance is being applied. So to me, the moment arm is a space. It's just a distance, right? So you can see what has more space and what has less space, right? So I don't use a perpendicular arrow or a perpendicular bar. So that's why I said that it's actually parallel, but I understand that he uses a different method, a different I guess you could say vernacular. So it's just semantics. It's not a
So
difference.
you thought he was using the same way as you using to define moment arm?
Yeah, when I first read it, I thought what he was actually trying to say was that the lines indicating the direction of resistance are parallel to the direction of resistance. So that's why I put parallel. When I went back and read it, and I saw some of his examples, I saw what he's actually doing is he's actually drawn. You can see that, and go back and look at mine. In none of mine, except for that linear thing, do I ever do a bar. I just have parallel lines. This is the direction of resistance. Here's the pivot. Here's the end of the lever, parallel. What's that space?
Mm-hmm.
Is that more or less than this space?
Right.
So that's just the way that I define it. So that's just semantics. Okay, so this was interesting. So he says, Doug repeatedly uses scales without accounting for total mass, and in some cases lever length, which then makes them not accurate, which was part of my issue in the first place.
Repeat.
Arms, baskets, carabiners need to be part of the math. Well, this is ridiculous, right? The levers are the same length. The carabiners are the same carabiners. The baskets are the same baskets. In other words, what we're doing here is we're measuring the variable. What's the variable? The limb angle. All factors being equal. In other words, if you're measuring tricep load on skull crushers versus parallel bar dips, in both cases, the resistance is applied in the hand, whether it's a dumbbell or whether it's a parallel bar dip that you're holding on to. And so you're talking about the same length forearm. You're talking about the same forearm, which is the same length, right? We're talking about the same tricep, which has the same attachment to the forearm. Everything is the same. The only thing that's different is the angle of the limb relative to the direction of resistance. We're measuring the variable. It's important for you to understand the effect of limb angle relative to the direction of resistance. How do you know that? You can do it using a scale, or you can do it, just by saying, well, how far percentage-wise is that lever tilting away from the neutral position or toward the most active position, right? So it's just a ballpark eyeball way of figuring out, oh, it's about half the load I could be getting. It's about a quarter of the load. Here, now this is interesting because here what I'm showing you is that a 20-degree lever, again, as I said earlier, is 23% active. 23% is pretty close to 25%. And what do we have there? We have five. No, that's four. That's 4 weights to 1, right? So it works well. It proves efficiency. Which would you rather, if you're going to get X amount of load on your tricep, would you rather use less weight or more weight? As long as it's the same load on the tricep. Logically speaking, you'd be better off using the lesser load. All right. So that last thing about the lever arm and the baskets and the carabiners and the mass and the baskets, that's just the distraction. This is just him throwing smoke up, right? To try to confuse people, just like the femur lane thing. It's irrelevant, right? Anybody with 2 eyes can see that on that pendulum, we're using equal lever lengths, same basket, same everything, other than, so to try to say that, that's not a good way of proving anything is ridiculous. It's a very good way of proving it. It's a perfect way of proving it, right? It says everything you need to know, all factors being equal. This is the effect of the limb angle. So, it doesn't matter what I offer as proof. We can use a balance scale. We can use respectable endorsers, happy customers, proven muscular results, photos of protractors, empirical evidence. He will find something to criticize. He'll say it's an illusion. He'll say that sensation doesn't prove anything. He'll say that, this person with these great results, they, had a genetic advantage. This person, didn't know any better. They got good results because they were doing. This is not a reasonable conversation. This is politics, right? So you can't have a conversation with someone who does not follow logic, sensibility, honesty. You can't converse this way. This is bias. This is politics, right? Try convincing, right? We know Republicans and Democrats, don't agree on anything, right? Try imagining one person convincing the other. They refuse, right? That's the situation we've got here. He refuses to see that a balance scale proves something. He refuses to see that, or he refuses to concede. He sees it, but he refuses to let you, know that he concedes. And it's not telling you the truth because, you're not accounting for the same lever lengths, the same baskets, the same everything. So it's difficult because, I can see the falsehoods, right? I can see, the misrepresentations because I know what I'm looking at, but the audience that doesn't know would say, "Oh God, I guess he's correct," and he's not. So this is interesting. So he says, the first thing he says is that he shows a clip of me saying that I'm pioneering, and he's using it out of context. So
no, he didn't show a clip of you
no,
pioneering. He said it.
No,
Yeah.
he says that we showed a video.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We showed a video of him saying that he's pioneering,
Right.
but that it was taken out of context. So the only thing I can say about that is maybe he's right. Maybe what he meant to say is that he's pioneering the slandering of a person with falsehoods and misrepresentations. That's what he's pioneering. Although he's not the first person to do that, right? So I can't actually say he's pioneering it. But the fact is that I don't know exactly what he was saying about the pioneering. I've never even used the word. He was clearly using the word. Maybe he was talking about a different context. But what I do know for a fact is he has attempted to slander by using falsehood and misrepresentations. So in my mind, you can apply the word pioneering to that probably with greater accuracy than the other. The second thing he says here, what I think is interesting, is he says, I consistently credit Tom Purvis. Now he says that because he's saying, I'm not saying that I'm pioneering anything. I say Tom Purvis pioneered it. Well, I never said that Tom Purvis didn't pioneer it. And I never said that I did pioneer it, right?
And even if you hear Tom Purvis himself said that he don't pioneer anything.
Did Tom Purvis say that?
Oh, he said, I never admit or say that I'm pioneering anything. I'm always learning.
Yeah. Well, then he's a wonderful man. I have the highest respect for Tom. I have always liked what he said. I've always agreed with what he said, understood what he said. I haven't said anything that's in conflict with what Tom has said. I would happily sit in a room with Tom. I would happily interview with Tom, right? Tom is a reasonable, logical, sensible man, right? So no discredit there at all, right? But what Kassem is doing is drastically different than what Tom was doing. He might take some of what Tom is saying, right, and try to put a spin on it to make it uniquely his own. But I've never claimed to be inventing this stuff at all, right? This is I've said from the very beginning, this is all out there. I've said from you even know this. I've said this to you. This is all out there. Anyone can corroborate this. All you have to do is Google some of the things I've said. You'll find reciprocal innervation. You'll find opposite position loading. You'll find early phase loading. You'll find all these things out there. Now, there's not a lot of resources that have it all in one place, which I think is good that we've done that. But I've never said I invented this stuff, and I like Tom Purvis. All right, so next slide. So the next thing he says in that same slide is he also portrays anyone who agrees with me in a very negative light as if it's a conspiracy. I've never thought it's a conspiracy. I've never thought these guys are in cahoots. I've never thought that these guys have gotten together and said, hey, let's get together and slander Doug Brignole. I've never said that, right? Now, what I have said is that I don't like the fact that Kassem gets on these programs and basically pulls the wool over the eyes of these podcasters. They don't know what's right or wrong, right? And he's very slick at, like he'll throw this 3-time moment arm thing out there, and these podcasters aren't going to double check. They're not going to do what I just did to actually show that 18 is 0.8 times more than 10. Not even 2 times more than 10. It certainly isn't 3 times more than 10, even on a straight line. So what's bothered me is that a couple of times they've had these titles that misrepresent what I'm all about, what I teach, because they're taking Kassem's word for it. And that's the part that I've thought isn't fair. So here's an example. Now, this is a thumbnail for the latest interview, or one of the latest interviews, with Dave McConey from Brains and Gains and Kassem. And it says the math is just wrong. Now, I spoke with Dave today and we were talking about this, and he didn't even know. He hadn't even seen this, right? And he said, oh my God, he goes, my graphics guy made that. I didn't make that. When I wrote it, I put a question mark on the end of it. Actually, what would have been better, if anything, a question mark with quotation marks, because then it would indicate that the math is just wrong is what Kassem has said, right? But to put it like that, math is just wrong, no quotation marks, no question mark, basically says that as a fact. And basically it also says that Kassem is qualified to determine that the math is just wrong, when I've just shown you all the different examples of why the math isn't wrong and why he is deceptive in trying to suggest that the math is wrong, right? So that's the problem I've had. It's not that I'm trying to suggest these guys are conspiring against me or that they're bad guys. It's just that I just don't think that they're able to see the deceptions, and they're not able to question it, and they're not able to challenge it. And so, they smile, they nod, and they look like they're agreeing. It's not that they're necessarily agreeing. They just don't know how to refute it. They don't know how to challenge it, right? And they're not my agents. They're not supposed to be defending me, right? But I frankly, I don't like this idea of people wanting to see mudslinging. And that's what happens, right? So when you see a title, and by the way, the graphics guy probably understands that the more contentious the title is, the more views it's going to get, the more clicks it's going to get. Like I just saw a title for a podcast that says vitamins cause cancer. All right, well, that's pretty scandalous, right? So is it true? Well, yeah, it could be, but marginally, right? When you say, if you were to say, 3% of vitamin overdoses increase your risk of cancer, that's not going to get much attention. But if you say vitamins cause cancer, as if they all do, and that they all cause it a lot, right? That's scandalous. And so that's going to get clicks and views. That tends to be what we see with podcasts. We tend to see contention. We tend to see bold, outrageous claims like the math is just wrong, and that gets views and clicks. But look, no one's going to get hurt by a title that says vitamins cause cancer. No one's going to get hurt by that. I get hurt by this. The math is just wrong is false. It's provably false. And yet that's what people see, and that's what they click on, and that's what they believe. And it's just not right. All right. So as I said here, Dave might just say, well, I just quoted Kassem, but Dave had my book at his fingertips, right? So when I interviewed with him, we had a nice conversation. I sent him my book for free. He had it. Now, granted, he's a busy guy. He's got a lot on his plate. He's a dentist, so he's working all the time. And he's also producing these videos. And, he's trying to keep up with, he hasn't even seen our last video because, it's on his list, right? He's backed up. He's got graphics people making these graphics. He didn't have time to make his own graphics, right? So he's busy. So I understand that he didn't have time to read my book, but if he had read my book, he would have seen that Doug disclaims using accurate math, and he explains that it's just a rough way to get an estimation of efficient loading versus inefficient loading. So if he had read my book, he could have challenged that when Kassem said it. He could have said, wait a minute now, isn't it true that Doug disclaims this in his book, like on page 37? Very early, he explains, this isn't trigonometry. This is just a simplified method to determine what is more efficient and what is less efficient. Now, what would Kassem have said? Would he have said, yeah, I saw that in the book, but I chose to ignore it? Would he say, no, I didn't see that, despite having said that he read all my material? But, that's a challenge that Dave couldn't offer because he hadn't read my book, even though he has it in his possession. So that's the kind of thing that bothers me is, it's false representation of what we've actually said. And and he's trying to vilify me, even though there's nothing to vilify. So here's the thing is there are hundreds of fitness influencers out there, right? And a lot of them are making ridiculous exercise recommendations. We've all seen them, right? You guys have all seen them, right? A lot of them are really dangerous exercises. We've seen some things that, you'd be lucky if you didn't get injured. right? Kassem could have gone after them, right? He didn't. Of all the influencers he could have chosen to go after and do his concern for the community, he chose me, a person with over 40 years experience, significant accomplishments in the field, significant endorsements, lots of happy customers, right? A common sense approach. So is this really a concern for the community? I mean, there are people out there like doing ridiculous things. Or would it be more accurate to believe that he went after me because he sees me as a potential threat, because I somehow undermine, I don't know what, his credibility? I don't exactly know, but I can tell you this much. What we're recommending is not dangerous. What we're recommending is very sensible. So what is there to guard against? Look, I didn't attack him. I didn't say anything publicly about him ever. We didn't put out a video about him. He puts out this video about me saying phony physics, and there wasn't not one single legitimate issue that he had correct. Not one. It was just filled with false accusations, deceptions, misrepresentations. Then when I reveal those, when I show you that the forearm isn't drawn right, when I show you that, this is wrong and that is wrong, then the wolf cries foul. Oh, he's coming after me. It's like, dude, I was just sitting here minding my own business, doing good work, right? And then you launch this completely false campaign with completely false allegations. So what? Now you're going to say, now I'm the bad guy? It's like, I'm just clarifying. That's all I'm doing. I'm just clarifying and showing where the misrepresentations are. Look, if you don't want your deceptions revealed, your false accusations, your frivolous and misleading things, don't post a video full of bullshit. I'm going to reveal your bullshit. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to reveal your bullshit. Look, I don't like doing it. I have more productive things to do than that. But what this guy's been doing is not good. It's not professional. As I said in my first video, it's scientific misconduct. It is misrepresentation. And I'm sure that anybody who's reasonable, who sees how he has distorted the truth, this whole 18 degrees versus 10 degrees, this whole 3-time moment arm, all of this stuff, is, the issue of the baskets and the lever length. This is all just smoke. So look, we have better things to do than to, try to clear up false accusations. We've got, a lot of good information to share with people. It's important to understand the factors that determine what qualifies as a good exercise. It's all extremely sensible. It doesn't require a leap of faith, right? It's all provable. It's all measurable, as I said, with the scales. And so I just urge you to, use your common sense. Here's another thing I want to say kind of along that lines is our course teaches you to think. Our course teaches you to be independent. Our course teaches you to use principles and factors to measure exercises and come to conclusions about which would be a more efficient way to load the triceps or the pectorals or the quadriceps or whatever. And then you can do that for the cell. But what happens so often is that people don't trust their own ability to think. And one example of that is this. In a recent interview with Dave McConey, Kassem said, there's been a lot of conversation about whether turning the toes in or turning the toes out during leg extension affects different parts of the quadricep. And it turns out they've just done a study that has shown that you can actually influence which part of the quadricep you affect by turning your toes in or turning your toes out. And Dave goes, really? Okay, so that's what happens is when someone says there was a study that was done and all of a sudden people abandon their logic.
Yeah.
It's like
so easy.
Let me explain this to you. Your quadriceps, you have 4 parts of the quadricep. Actually, you have a 5th, but it's sort of irrelevant. You have 4 parts of the quadricep. All 4 parts converge on one single tendon. That tendon, it's called the quadricep tendon, goes over the knee and becomes the patella tendon. The patella tendon attaches to one single spot on the tibia. The knee joint is basically a hinge. It bends one way, right? It doesn't go this way or that way or up the center. It goes straight, right? So logically speaking, when you turn the toes in or your toes out, nothing changes in what I just described. You still have only one patella tendon, one quadricep tendon. You still have one attachment. You still have one joint action, right? So in order for toes in, toes out to actually cause a different part of the quadricep to function more or less than the other, it would have to somehow translate into a different direction of knee movement. And the only way you can get a different direction of knee movement is if you had a joint that wasn't a hinge. Mm-hmm. It would require kind of a ball and socket joint that can go in various directions. And it would require, to some degree, different tendons, right? So if you have a tendon from this part of the muscle and one from this part of the muscle, and you can cause this one to work more than this one, you can cause this part of the quadricep to work more than this part. But it doesn't work that way. There's no way that the quadricep could know which way the foot is angled. So look, I'm all for understanding every possible nuance in resistance exercise, but you and us and everybody needs to be able to think and say, well, if that is possible, how does it happen? What's the mechanism? What makes the difference? If I turn my toes out, oh, it makes my knee angle do like there's no, the knee does one thing. The patella tendon does one thing. They act in unison. There's no way that you can cause one part to work more than the other part unless you change that mechanism somehow, right? So logically speaking, we have to be skeptics. You have to ask, how does that work? There was a study that was done that showed that the end of this muscle could be contracted more than this other end of the muscle. Well, how does that work? How could it work? I mean, basically that rope, that muscle is like a rope. It's pulling its limb, which, is crossing a joint, and it's causing that joint to move. And so it's just logically impossible.
Let me give you an example that he mentions of how you can target the long hair. He's saying, like, you can have a cable coming from here. Okay, you're holding the cable and you're pushing it this way. Okay, so the cable is coming from here behind me, and then pushing it this way to target the long.
No, look, so I mean, the only thing that alters the I guess you could say the participation of the long head is changing the shoulder angle. So if it's down, it's not as stretched. If it's up, it's more stretched. Okay, but then you have to say, well, does more stretch contribute to more activation? Does more stretch contribute to more growth? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Okay, but this is not much different than this. Now, I'm not saying that this exercise is a bad exercise. It's good enough. It's as good as a regular, but there's no way that it could actually cause, right? And again, for the same reason as the quadricep, because all three heads of the tricep converge on one single tendon, and the tendon crosses the elbow joint, and the elbow joint is still doing the exact same thing it was doing in other exercises. It's extending. So all three heads have to work simultaneously, right? So, I'd be happy to have this conversation with a reasonable person, with any reasonable person, and we can look at mechanisms. We can try to find out what could cause, what might cause, and then test it in several ways, right? But and we see a lot of videos by influencers out there that'll say, if you do this, it does this. Anybody can say that, right? But at the end of the day, we have to ask how does that work? If that's true, how does that work? I mean, we have to be able to identify the mechanism that causes this versus that, right? And, we can't just assume that an EMG study came to the right conclusion, right? We have to assume the possibility that the people who were conducting that study either didn't read it right or, maybe had an agenda, right? But in any case, and I'm not saying that we need to, let's say, well, maybe, and because of so many deceptions that Kassem has shown, I would doubt anything that he says at this point. In fact, there's an old saying, it's like, how do we know that Kassem's lying? His lips are moving. Right? I mean, at this point, he's demonstrated himself to be dishonest, right? So just at this point, I would say almost anything that he say is suspect. But if Chris Beardsley says something, he says, I saw a study that said this and this and this. Now I don't know whether Chris did the study or whether he was just reading the study, but it almost doesn't matter. I trust Chris Beardsley. I think he's a great scientist. I think he's a great reporter. Now, sometimes we interpret things differently, and that's fair. And he and I are friends. We've spoken a number of times. He's a fair-minded person, and we can sort of together say, well, if that happens, how does that happen? But I think a lot of times people aren't skeptical enough, and they just assume that if a study was done, it was correct. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand that, it's important to not abandon our thinking. It's important to not abandon our logic, right? If someone says something, it's important to say, well, does that make sense? Like when Kassem says that 18 degrees forearm tilt produces a moment arm 3 times more than Doug's 10-degree model, people should say, well, wait a minute. How is that? Well, see, you have to understand a little bit of physics. You have to understand that 18 is 0.8 times more than 10, right? So it isn't even twice as much as 10. So it can't produce a 3-time greater moment arm. But plus it's also on the curve, which means it loses. So, but most people just go, oh, okay.
People don't pay attention. Not everyone is qualified to go through that, to analyze that. Some people just listen to buzzwords, and that's how they make the decision. They don't understand what they mean.
And Kassem knows that. Kassem knows that most people have no clue. He could say anything he wants, and if the person isn't sharp enough to catch it, they'll just believe it. I mean, I've heard people say, I don't know if what he said was true, but it sounded like he knew what he was talking about, which is what I said in my last video. It's like, can you imagine if you're talking to an investment planner, and he's basically Bernie Madoff. He's basically telling you this and this and this. And you go, he sure sounds like he knows what he's talking about. It's like, no, he's not. He's not being honest with you.
So he probably, I don't know if he's going to do another video about this, but I think it's enough videos about this if he do it again. I don't know, like it's becoming ridiculous. I think it's obvious what is our message. Like we're always going to defend these things based on the 16 biomechanical factor that we're teaching. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the video he did with Dave, he said, that he had interacted with me on email, right? And so we were talking about, the one arm pull in versus this, right?
No, it's this.
Oh, is he coming from the other side?
It's here, yeah. He's not coming straight. He's coming.
All right. Well, the picture I saw, it looked like he was coming straight. But anyway, so he said that that Doug explained the 16 reasons why it was a good exercise. That's false. Because, the 16 factors don't all apply to every exercise. Mm-hmm. There are 16 factors, but some, like, for example, if we're talking about, active insufficiency or passive insufficiency or reciprocal innervation, not every exercise qualifies for that. It depends on the mechanics of each individual exercise, or I should say of the anatomy that's participating. But I think there was like 7 or 8 points. And I said, it's full range of motion, it's opposite position loaded. The trajectory is consistent with the muscle fibers. I went through this whole thing, but of course, and I didn't know then as well as I know now that he will never concede. This is just he refutes everything and refutes everything for the ridiculous reason. So in his video with Dave, he was saying that the problem that with mine was that it is the completely wrong resistance curve. So what I said to Dave today is, the resistance curve has nothing to do with whether you're pulling from here or here or here. The resistance curve has to do with whether the resistance is coming from super high and you're starting low, or in other words, you can have the same resistance curve with his exercise as with mine based on the height of the pulley, right? And you can alter the resistance curve by either making the cable higher or lower, or you moving away from it or closer to it, right? Mm-hmm. So, So that was nonsense, right? You can use any resistance curve you want with either exercise, right? And what I said is, you're better off having opposite position loading rather than having the resistance wrap around, right, the muscle that you actually want to work. And if you're going to reach across your body, you're automatically going to load your rear deltoid. You're automatically going to. Now, could you get more stretch on your lat if you do that? Yeah, you probably could get more stretch on your lat, but you're still loading the rear deltoid more than the lat.
But this back to like a stretch is not that. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing.
Right. Anyway, so but the point is, this is just what he does. It's rhetoric. It's he talks over the heads of people, because he throws out figures, the femur length, 3-time moment arm, and these people are lost. And they don't have enough education, they don't have enough knowledge to challenge it or refute it or say, but wait a minute, his exercise seems an awful lot like yours. I mean, how could his be the worst, even though his is closer to yours than a T-bar row or than a bent over barbell row? How could it be the worst? I mean, we've been doing lat pull downs and chin ups for years, and we've developed some fantastic lats sometimes with just lat pull downs. And the one arm pull in is very similar to a lat pull down. Right. So how can the lat pull down and the chin ups build these fantastic backs and doing one arm at a time with its own separate resistance be the worst? It just doesn't make any sense. But this is what he does. This is what politicians do. I mean, there's lots of examples of that. All you got to do is turn on the news and you'll see some politicians saying, this is the worst thing in the world. The other person, this is the best thing in the world. This is what politicians do. Right. But I ask you to just use common sense. Just use logic. Use, by the way, sensation. Right. If you do a one arm pull in, you can feel how good that feels on you. You can feel the lat pump. You can see the lat growth, even if, and these people have all been doing, Renzo Algieri and Jim Everton, and Thor. These people have all been doing they've just re-entered competition now. Because
I mean, there's over 1,000 people in our platform doing that.
And these
plus the people who bought the book, I don't know how many.
Yeah, look at Wallace Ragu. Look at the physique he's developed, right? And he's a veteran. He's been doing it a long time. This isn't the first time. He's not green, right? So, and he said to me, this is a game changer for me. One arm pull-ins is a game changer for me, right? So, what would Kassem say? Well, they don't know the difference. You can't use sensation, and sensation is misleading. It's like, okay, so then all you want us to do is just trust you. You got a lab. Your lab tests show this. We're going to believe you. Never mind thinking, never mind using logic, never mind using common sense, never mind using sensation, never mind using results. This is ridiculous.
Look, I hope they got good clarification from this video. Like, look, it's like 2 hours, and you put together the slides and stuff. I believe we should focus on better debates, like Tom Purvis or whatever, not debates, like good conversations that people will benefit from. Right. And of course, all the details, you will find them in the book or in the online courses. Yeah. What we're telling you here is a little bit of what we really talk about in the book, because the book goes in details and how you get to these biomechanical factors and the exercises. If you don't want to read, you can watch the videos. We show exactly like what's happening in the book, but with slides. So if you don't have time to read, you can watch all this, to educate. So tell us if you like this video or not. And Doug, thank you for your time. And we will meet again in the next video.
Yes, sounds good, Mo. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.